The claiming ceremony ended the same way it began, with Lyra Thorne standing alone. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are just the universe preparing us for who we're meant to become, but Lyra couldn't see any purpose in this particular agony, couldn't find meaning in the way every unmated alpha in the Crescent Moon Pack had looked right through her as if she were made of glass. Worse than glass, glass could at least catch light. The autumn air bit through her ceremonial dress, a pale blue thing that had belonged to her sister, hemmed hastily that morning because even her family hadn't expected her to make it to the claiming stage. The fabric hung loose around her small frame, emphasizing everything she lacked: curves that never filled out properly, a scent so faint most wolves had to strain to catch it, a wolf that had never emerged, not even during her 18th birthday when the moon had been full and every instinct should have called her beast forward. She was Omega in name only. In reality, she was nothing. The other unmated females clustered near the bonfire, surrounded by alphas and betas who circled them like predators scenting prey. Laughter carried on the wind, bright, musical sounds that felt like daggers in Lyra's chest. Maya Blackwood threw her head back as Alpha Marcus whispered something in her ear, her auburn hair catching the firelight like liquid copper. Even from 50 feet away, Lyra could smell the thick, honeyed scent of arousal and claiming that would happen before dawn. She pressed deeper into the shadows at the edge of the clearing, autumn leaves crunching under her worn boots. The ceremony was supposed to be a celebration, a night when unmated wolves found their perfect match, when the moon goddess blessed new unions that would strengthen the pack. For most, it was the most important night of their lives. For Lyra, it had been 3 hours of systematic rejection. "Still here, little mouse?" The voice made her stomach clench. Brett Hartwell materialized from behind an oak tree, his beta build imposing even in the dim moonlight. He'd been her childhood friend once, before they'd understood what the hierarchy meant, before he'd learned that associating with the pack's failure could damage his own standing. "The ceremony isn't over," she said quietly, though they both knew it was. The choosing had been done within the first hour. Everyone who mattered had been claimed. Brett's laugh held no warmth. "It was over for you before it started." He stepped closer, and she caught his scent, pine and leather and the sharp edge of disdain. "Did you really think anyone would want a defective Omega? You can barely shift, can barely hold a scent. What could you possibly offer a mate?" Heat flooded her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "The moon goddess hasn't finished." "The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes." His eyes glittered with cruel amusement. "She made you exactly what you are, a reminder to the rest of us of what failure looks like." Each word landed like a physical blow, but Lyra had learned long ago not to flinch. She'd heard variations of this speech from pack members her entire life. Her parents had stopped defending her years ago, worn down by the shame of having a daughter who couldn't even manage the most basic aspects of wolf existence. "I should go," she whispered. "Yes, you should, before someone mistakes you for an actual Omega worth claiming." Brett melted back into the shadows, leaving her alone with the sounds of celebration she'd never be part of. Lyra wrapped her arms around herself and began the long walk home, each step carrying her further from the warmth and light and belonging she'd never truly expected to find. The pack house sat dark and quiet when she reached it. Her parents had gone to bed hours ago. They hadn't even stayed to see if she'd be chosen. Her sister Emma's room glowed with candlelight. No doubt she was preparing for her own claiming ceremony next year, when she'll have alphas lined up to court her properly developed Omega scent. Lyra climbed the stairs to her small attic room, the floorboards creaking under her weight. She caught her reflection in the window glass. pale skin made paler by the moonlight, brown hair that refused to hold any style, hazel eyes that couldn't decide what color they wanted to be. Even her own reflection seemed uncertain of her existence. She sank onto her narrow bed and finally allowed herself to cry. Not the pretty tears that made other Omegas look delicate and in need of protection, but ugly, silent sobs that shook her small frame. This was supposed to be the night that changed everything, the night she found her place in the world. Instead, it had only confirmed what everyone already knew. She was unwanted, unclaimed, unworthy. Outside her window, winter pressed against the glass with icy fingers, promising months of cold that would mirror the emptiness growing in her chest. Tomorrow, she would have to face the pack again, face the pity and scorn and casual cruelty that came with being the only unmated Omega left. But tonight, she could mourn the future she'd lost, the mate who would never claim her, the children she'd never bear, the respect she'd never earn. Lyra pulled her knees to her chest and stared out at the moon that had witnessed her humiliation. She had no idea that in 3 days, everything would change. The kitchen smelled of grease and disappointment at dawn. Lyra's knees pressed against cold stone as she scrubbed the massive hearth, her hands raw from the coarse brush and harsh soap. Soot clung to everything, her hair, her clothes, the spaces under her fingernails that no amount of washing could reach. 3 days had passed since the claiming ceremony, and already the pack had found new ways to remind her of her place, or lack of it. "Faster!" Mrs. Chen's voice cracked like a whip behind her. The head cook had never liked Lyra, but since the ceremony, her disdain had crystallized into something sharper. "The Alpha's breakfast won't prepare itself, and I won't have him asking why the kitchen smells like failure." Lyra bit back the response that burned on her tongue. She'd learned years ago that defending herself only made things worse. Better to absorb the cruelty like she absorbed everything else, silently, completely, until it became part of the ache that lived permanently in her chest. The brush slipped from her numb fingers, clattering against the stone. Mrs. Chen tsked, a sound loaded with disgust. "Clumsy as well as useless. Your parents should have exposed you as a pup and saved us all the trouble." The words hit like physical blows, but Lyra kept scrubbing. In the old days, before modern pack law, defective pups were left in the wilderness to die. Mrs. Chen wasn't the first to suggest Lyra would have been better off that way. Sometimes, in her darkest moments, Lyra wondered if they were right. Steam rose from the massive pots as the morning meal took shape around her. Thick porridge for the working wolves, fresh bread and honey for the ranked members, delicate pastries that would never touch her lips. The hierarchy of the pack played out in every meal, every privilege, every small kindness that flowed around her like water around stone. "Take this to the Alpha's family." Mrs. Chen thrust a heavy tray into Lyra's arms. "And try not to drop it. We can't afford to waste food on your clumsiness." The tray trembled in Lyra's grip, not from weakness, but from the proximity to everything she'd never have. Silver utensils that caught the morning light, fruit that had been imported from southern packs, cream so thick it coated the pitcher like silk. She climbed the servant stairs to the main house, her bare feet silent on worn wood. The Alpha's family lived in luxury that seemed almost obscene compared to the stark quarters where unmated wolves slept 4 to a room. Thick carpets, windows that faced the sunrise, space to breathe without bumping into someone else's disappointment. Emma's laughter drifted from the dining room as Lyra approached, bright and musical, the sound of someone who'd never doubted her place in the world. Lyra paused outside the doorway, watching her sister through the crack. Her younger sister sat beside their parents, golden hair catching the light as she gestured excitedly. Even at 17, Emma radiated the kind of confident sensuality that made alphas trip over themselves for attention. Her scent was already developing the rich, complex notes that would drive males wild during her claiming ceremony. Everything Lyra wasn't. "The Henderson Alpha asked Father's permission to court me," Emma was saying, spreading jam on toast with delicate fingers. "Can you imagine? He's only 25, and his pack controls 3 territories." Their mother beamed with pride. "My clever girl, I told you patience would pay off." Their father nodded approvingly. "Henderson's a good match. Strong bloodline, wealthy territory. You'll be a proper alpha's mate." Nobody mentioned the daughter who stood listening in the hallway. The daughter who would never be courted, never be claimed, never make them proud. Lyra knocked softly and entered, keeping her eyes down as she set the tray on the sideboard. The conversation died instantly, as if her presence had sucked the joy from the room. "Thank you," her mother said, stiffly, not meeting her eyes. That was all. No good morning, no inquiry about how she was adjusting to her new duties, just cold acknowledgments of her function as a servant in her own family's presence. Emma's gaze flicked over her, taking in the soot-stained clothes and reddened hands. Something like pity flickered across her perfect features, but hardening into something worse, embarrassment. "You smell like smoke," Emma said quietly. Not cruelly, almost gently, but the words cut deeper than Mrs. Chen's deliberate viciousness because they came wrapped in concern that only highlighted the distance between them. Lyra curtsied and backed towards the door. "I'll let you finish your meal." She fled before anyone could respond, before the pity in Emma's eyes could destroy what little dignity she had left. The servant's stares blurred as tears threatened, but she blinked them back. Crying was a luxury she couldn't afford in a place where weakness was blood in the water. The next 3 hours passed in endless, mind-numbing tasks, scrubbing floors until her back screamed, hauling water until her shoulders burned, mending clothes for wolves who had everything while she had nothing. But as her hands worked, her mind wandered to places it shouldn't go. She imagined walking into the dining room with her head high, wearing a dress that fit properly. Imagined an alpha, strong and handsome and kind, standing beside her, his hand warm on her back. Imagine her parents looking at her with pride instead of shame, Emma hugging her instead of avoiding her scent. Imagined being wanted. The fantasies were dangerous because they felt so real in the moment before reality crashed back in. Each dream was a small death, a reminder of everything she'd never have. By midday, the pack house buzzed with excitement. Word had spread through the ranks like wildfire. The Alpha King would be arriving tomorrow for a diplomatic meeting with their alpha. Protocol demanded perfection in every detail, from the gleaming floors to the precisely folded napkins. Lyra found herself assigned to the most degrading tasks, cleaning the guest quarters' chamber pots, polishing boots, scrubbing the mud from the front steps where important wolves would walk. But as she worked, something shifted inside her. Maybe it was the repetitive motion of scrubbing. Maybe it was the solidarity she felt with other servants who barely looked at her but didn't actively torment her. Maybe it was simply the exhaustion that came from having nothing left to lose. She began to notice things. The way Mrs. Chen's hands shook when she thought no one was looking, not with age, but with arthritis that made her own life painful. The scars on the groundskeeper's arms that spoke of battles fought and survived. The quiet kindness of the laundrywoman who left small pieces of bread where Lyra would find them. These wolves at the bottom of the hierarchy aren't broken. They were surviving, enduring, finding small moments of dignity in thankless work. Maybe there was strength in that. Maybe there was strength in her. As the sun set and the pack house settled into evening quiet, Lyra climbed to her tiny room with aching muscles and raw hands, but something new flickering in her chest. Tomorrow, the Alpha King would arrive.
Tomorrow, everything would change in ways she couldn't imagine.
Power arrived like a storm front, pressing against the windows before anyone could see the horizon. Lyra felt it first in the kitchen at dawn, a prickling along her spine that made her hands still on the bread dough she was kneading. The sensation crawled over her skin like electricity before lightning strikes, raising every tiny hair on her arms until her wolf, dormant as it was, whimpered somewhere deep in her chest. Something was coming. Around her, the other kitchen staff moved with increasing agitation. Mrs. Chen snapped at servants who had done nothing wrong. The scullery maids kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see something terrible approaching through the morning mist. Even the kitchen cats had disappeared, fled to whatever hiding places animals instinctively sought when predators drew near. "What's wrong with everyone today?" muttered Jacob, the youngest cook, as he fumbled with a pot that slipped from his nervous fingers. Mrs. Chen whirled on him, her face pale beneath its usual stern mask. "Alpha King Thane arrives within the hour. If you can't feel his approach, boy, then you're more broken than I thought." Alpha King Thane. The name alone sent ice through Lyra's veins. She'd heard whispers about him her entire life, stories that parents told children to make them behave, warnings that kept grown wolves awake at night. He ruled the Northern Territories with absolute authority, commanding not just one pack, but dozens. They said he was the strongest alpha born in 3 generations, that he'd killed his first challenger at 16 and hadn't lost a fight since. They said other things too, darker things. That he'd never taken a mate because no omega could survive his intensity. That he consumed lesser wolves the way fire consumed paper, completely without mercy. "Back to work," Mrs. Chen barked, but her voice cracked on the words. "Everything must be perfect. Any mistake will be blamed on this kitchen, and I won't have the Alpha King's displeasure fall on my head." Lyra kneaded the dough with mechanical precision, but her mind raced. What did an Alpha King want with their small pack? The Crescent Moon territory was prosperous enough, but hardly significant in the greater political landscape. They produced decent farmland and timber, kept their borders secure, paid their tributes on time. Unless someone had failed to pay tribute, unless someone had broken pack law, unless... The pressure in the air doubled, then tripled, until Lyra's knees nearly buckled. Through the kitchen windows she caught sight of them, a convoy of black vehicles moving up the mountain road like a funeral procession. No flags, no banners, nothing to announce their arrival except the suffocating weight of dominance that preceded them. Mrs. Chen grabbed Lyra's shoulder with bruising force. "You, upstairs, help serve the welcome feast, and for the love of the moon goddess, try not to shame us all with your clumsiness." Lyra nodded mutely and grabbed the nearest serving tray, her hands trembling so badly the silver rattled against the porcelain. She'd never served at a formal pack function. Her status was too low, her presence too embarrassing. But apparently today they needed every available body. The great hall had been transformed. Every surface gleamed with fresh polish, the ancient banners hung at perfect angles, and flowers from the pack's greenhouse created an illusion of spring warmth despite the gathering winter outside. The ranked members of the pack stood in rigid formation near the head table, their formal clothes unable to hide the tension radiating from every body. Alpha Morrison stood at the center, trying to project confident authority, but failing to hide the sweat beading on his forehead. His mate, Luna Sarah, clutched his arm with white knuckles. Even Emma, resplendent in a blue silk dress that matched her eyes, kept glancing toward the massive oak doors as if she might bolt at any moment. The pressure built until the very air seemed to vibrate. Then the doors opened. Alpha King Thane entered like darkness given form. He was taller than any wolf Lyra had ever seen, broad-shouldered and lean in the way of predators built for endurance.
His black hair was shorter than fashion dictated, practical rather than decorative, and his face could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and harsh planes that suggested no softness had ever touched him. But it was his eyes that made Lyra's breath catch in her throat. They were the pale green of winter ice, so light they seemed almost colorless, and they missed nothing as they swept the assembled pack. Power radiated from him in waves that made lesser wolves drop their gazes and bare their throats in instinctive submission. Even Alpha Morrison, a strong wolf in his own right, seemed diminished in the Alpha King's presence. "Your Majesty," Morrison's voice was steady, but Lyra caught the slight tremor underneath. "Welcome to Crescent Moon territory." The Alpha King nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to be both acknowledgement and dismissal. When he spoke, his voice was deep and rough, like distant thunder. "Morrison, your message mentioned border disputes with the Eastern Pacts." No pleasantries, no social niceties, straight to business, with the kind of blunt efficiency that made politicians nervous and enemies dead. Lyra pressed herself against the wall, trying to become invisible as she'd learned to do. The serving tray felt impossibly heavy in her hands as she watched the formal greeting unfold. She should leave, should retreat to the kitchen where she belonged, but something held her frozen in place. The Alpha King's gaze swept the room again, cataloguing faces, assessing threats, reading the pack dynamics with the calculating precision of a born ruler. His attention moved over the ranked wolves, dismissed the lesser members, started to pass over her completely, and stopped. Those pale green eyes locked onto her across the crowded hall, and the world tilted on its axis. For one impossible moment, Lyra forgot how to breathe. The Alpha King's gaze held hers with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare, as if he could see through skin and bone to whatever broken thing lived at her core. His nostrils flared slightly, and something flickered across his granite features. Confusion, maybe, or recognition of something that shouldn't exist. Heat flooded her cheeks as she realized she was staring at the most powerful wolf in the Northern Territories like a starstruck pup. She dropped her gaze immediately, curtsying so low her knees nearly touched the floor. But she could still feel her attention on her, like a physical weight. "Who is that?" The question cut through the formal atmosphere like a blade. Alpha Morrison followed the Alpha King's gaze to where Lyra stood frozen against the wall, and his face went carefully blank. "Nobody important, Your Majesty. A servant. She shouldn't be here." "I didn't ask what she shouldn't be doing." The Alpha King's voice carried the kind of quiet danger that made smart wolves back down immediately. Morrison's throat worked as he swallowed. "Lyra Thorne, Your Majesty. She assists in the kitchens." The Alpha King studied her for another long moment, and Lyra felt disnikened under that pale gaze. Then, abruptly, he turned away as if she'd ceased to exist. "Show me these border reports." The formal reception continued around her, but Lyra barely heard it. Her heart hammered against her ribs with the force of a trapped bird, and her skin burned where his gaze had touched. The serving tray shook in her hands until she had to set it down before she dropped it. "Nobody important," the words echoed in her head as she finally managed to retreat to the kitchen. Of course that's what Alpha Morrison had said. It was true after all. She was nobody important, just another broken Omega who cleaned floors and tried not to be noticed. But for one moment, the most powerful Alpha in the territories had noticed her. And something in those winter-cold eyes suggested he wasn't done looking.
The crystal goblet shattered against the stone floor like a gunshot in the tense silence of the great hall. Lyra's breath caught in her throat as shards of priceless glass scattered around her feet, each piece catching the firelight like accusations. The goblet had been in her hands one moment, steady, secure, and the next it was falling, slipping from fingers made clumsy by the weight of the Alpha King's attention from across the room. Time seemed suspended in that moment between the crash and consequence. Every eye in the hall turned toward her, Every conversation died mid-sentence, every breath held as the magnitude of her mistake settled over the formal dinner like a shroud. She had broken something irreplaceable in front of the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. Clumsy little mouse. Beata Morrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade. He rose from his seat at the head table, his face dark with the kind of rage that came from public embarrassment. "Do you have any idea what that goblet was worth? It belonged to my great-grandmother, passed down through 5 generations of pack leaders." Lyra dropped to her knees instantly, her hands hovering over the scattered pieces. "I'm sorry, Beata Morrison. I'm so sorry. I can try to repair it. You can do nothing." His voice rose, carrying across the hall with the authority of rank. "Nothing but cost this pack money and dignity in front of our honored guest." From the corner of her eye, Lyra saw the Alpha King watching the scene unfold. His pale green gaze was fixed on Morrison with an expression she couldn't read. Cold, calculating, dangerous in its stillness. Morrison stalked toward her, his movements predatory. 20 lashes, in the courtyard. Now, let everyone see what happens to servants who embarrass their betters. Lyra's blood turned to ice. 20 lashes with the silver-tipped whip would leave permanent scars, assuming she survived them at all. Her wolf was too weak to heal from silver poisoning. She would carry the marks forever, assuming infection didn't kill her first. "Please," she whispered, hating the way her voice broke. "Please, I'll work extra shifts. I'll pay for it somehow. You'll take your punishment like the worthless creature you are." Morrison grabbed her arm, his grip brutal enough to leave bruises. "Guards, escort this thing to the courtyard." The hall remained silent as Morrison dragged her toward the door, but Lyra could feel the weight of pity and disgust from the assembled pack. Some looked sorry for her. Others looked satisfied that the defective Omega was finally getting what she deserved. None of them moved to help her. They were 3 steps from the door when a voice stopped them cold. "Release her." The command was quiet, but it carried the kind of absolute authority that made lesser wolves freeze mid-motion. Morrison's grip on Lyra's arm loosened involuntarily as every instinct screamed at him to obey. Alpha King Thane rose from his seat with fluid grace, his pale eyes fixed on Morrison with predatory focus. "I said release her." "Your Majesty, with respect, this is a pack discipline matter. This is a matter of a host threatening to torture a servant for an accident in front of his guest." The Alpha King's voice remained level, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Morrison's face flushed red, but he released Lyra's arm. "She broke a family heirloom, Your Majesty. Surely you understand the need for consequences." "I understand the difference between justice and cruelty." The Alpha King moved down the length of the hall, his footsteps eerily silent on the stone floor. "The goblet was an accident. Your reaction is not." He stopped directly in front of Lyra, close enough that she could smell the winter scent that clung to his skin, pine and snow, and something wildly masculine that made her broken wolf whimper. She kept her eyes fixed on his boots, afraid to look up, afraid to breathe too deeply. "Look at me." The command was soft, but it pulled her gaze upward against her will. Those pale green eyes studied her face, taking in the tear tracks she hadn't realized were there, the way she trembled despite trying to hold still. "Are you injured?" The question confused her. No one had ever asked if she was injured from anything, not when pack members shoved her aside, not when she fell from trying to carry loads too heavy for her small frame, not when she cut her hands on broken dishes while cleaning. No, Your Majesty." "Good." He turned back to Morrison, and the beater actually took a step backward. "The girl will remain under my protection during my stay here. Any further disciplinary measures will go through me first." Morrison's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. To argue would be to challenge the Alpha King's authority, a mistake that could cost him his life.
But to agree would be to lose face in front of his own pack. "She's just a servant," he said finally. "She's under my protection." The Alpha King's tone suggested the conversation was over. "Return to your meal, Morrison. We have border disputes to discuss." The Beta had no choice but to return, his face burning with humiliation. The other pack members slowly returned to their conversations, though Lyra could feel their curious glances like pinpricks against her skin. She started to rise from her knees, but the Alpha King's hand on her shoulder kept her still. His touch was warm through the thin fabric of her servant's dress, and she had to fight not to lean into that unexpected comfort. "Can you stand?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. "Then walk with me, slowly, don't look at anyone else." She obeyed, rising on unsteady legs and falling into step beside him. He led her through a side door she hadn't noticed before, away from the curious eyes and whispered speculation of the pack. The corridor beyond was dimly lit, lined with ancient portraits of Morrison's ancestors. The Alpha King stopped beneath a painting of a long-dead pack leader, turning to face her with an expression she couldn't decipher. "You're frightened of me?" It wasn't a question. Lyra tried to deny it, but the words stuck in her throat. "Shall I ask why you helped me?" Something flickered across his granite features. "Does there need to be a reason?" "There's always a reason." The bitterness in her own voice surprised her. "Nobody helps someone like me without wanting something in return." His pale eyes studied her for a long moment. "Someone like you?" "Broken, useless, the pack failure everyone tolerates because they have to." "Is that what you think you are?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications she dared examine. Lyra wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly conscious of how she must look, dishevelled, tear-stained, wearing a servant's plain dress that had seen better years. "It's what everyone knows I am." The Alpha King stepped closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes. This close, she could see flecks of silver in the pale green, could feel the heat radiating from his large frame. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. The Alpha King was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words were barely audible. "I don't know yet." That should have terrified her more than any threat. Instead, it sent heat racing through her veins and made her wonder what it would feel like to be wanted by someone so powerful, even if she couldn't trust his reasons for wanting her at all.
The Alpha King found her in the gardens at dawn. Lyra had risen early, unable to sleep after the events of the previous evening. The memory of his hand on her shoulder, the way he'd looked at her in that dimly lit corridor, the quiet intensity in his voice when he'd said he didn't know what he wanted from her, it all churned in her mind like a storm she couldn't escape. She'd sought refuge in the only place that had ever brought her peace, her mother's rose garden, now wild and overgrown since Luna Sarah had lost interest in anything that didn't directly serve the pack's status. Lyra came here when the weight of being unwanted became too much to bear, when she needed to remember that beautiful things could still exist even when no one cared for them properly. Frost clung to the neglected roses, their final blooms of the season hanging heavy with ice crystals that caught the morning light like tears. She knelt beside the largest bush, carefully deadheading the spent flowers with practiced movements. Her mother had taught her this ritual years ago, back when Luna Sarah still acknowledged having a broken daughter. Before the pack rises, before the demands begin, that's when a garden shows you its true face, her mother had said, her voice soft with the kind of love Lyra barely remembered now. "You're bleeding." The voice behind her was quiet but unmistakable. Lyra's hands stilled on the thorny stems, her heart leaping into her throat as she felt the Alpha King's presence like heat against her back. She looked down at her hands, surprised to see thin lines of red where the thorns had caught her fingers. She'd been so lost in thought, so desperate for the peace this place used to bring her, that she hadn't noticed the pain. "It's nothing," she said without turning around, though her voice came out breathier than she'd intended. She heard his footsteps on the frosted grass, measured and deliberate, as he circled to face her. This close, in the soft morning light, she could see details she'd missed in the formal settings where they'd met before. The faint scar that ran along his left temple, disappearing into his dark hairline. The way his pale green eyes seemed less cold in natural light, more like sea glass worn smooth by endless storms. "Show me." It wasn't a request, but his tone lacked the commanding edge she'd heard him use with Morrison, carrying instead a quiet concern that made her chest tighten with confusion. She held out her hands reluctantly, watching as he studied the small cuts with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to their severity. His fingers were warm when they touched hers, calloused from weapons training, but surprisingly gentle as he turned her palms to catch the light. "You should be more careful." Something in his voice made her look up, and she was startled by the expression on his face. The granite mask had slipped, revealing something raw and almost protective, as if her small injuries mattered to him in a way that defied logic. "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. "Why do you care if I'm hurt?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he released her hands and moved to the stone bench beside the rosebush, sitting with a heavy weariness that made him seem suddenly less like an untouchable king and more like a man carrying invisible wounds. "I had a sister once." The words were so quiet she almost missed them. Lyra sank back on her heels, watching as the Alpha King stared at the neglected garden with eyes that saw something else entirely. "Younger than me, small, like you, gentle." His voice caught slightly on the word. She loved gardens, spent hours tending flowers that served no practical purpose, finding beauty in things others overlooked. Lyra's breath caught. He was talking about his sister in past tense, and the pain in his voice suggested the story didn't end well. What happened to her? His hands clenched into fists on his thighs. "I was 18 when I took the throne, young, arrogant, convinced that strength was the only currency that mattered. When a neighboring pack challenged our territory, I thought showing mercy was weakness." The garden seemed to hold its breath, even the wind stilling, as if nature itself was afraid to interrupt. "I was wrong." The words came out like broken glass. They took her during a raid on our outer settlements, used her to try to force my surrender. His pale eyes met hers, and she saw decades of guilt and rage burning in their depths. I chose pride over negotiation, chose to make them pay rather than pay their price. Lyra's heart clenched as understanding dawned. She died. She died because I was too proud to bend, too convinced of my own power to see that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is yield. His voice was raw now, stripped of all the authority and control she'd come to associate with him. They sent me her body piece by piece, started with her fingers, the same fingers that had tended roses like these. Horror washed over her in cold waves. No wonder he ruled with such absolute authority, such calculated ruthlessness. No wonder he'd never taken a mate, never allowed himself to care for someone who could be used against him. "That's why you helped me," she said softly. "Last night, with Morrison, I reminded you of her." Something flickered across his features, acknowledgement, maybe, or surprise that she'd understood so quickly. Partly, he was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made heat rise in her cheeks. "Then why?"
The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them seemed ready to face. The Alpha King rose from the bench and moved closer until she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. For one impossible moment, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he pulled back abruptly, his mask slamming back into place with almost audible force. "Go inside. The pack will be waking soon, and I won't have them seeing you with blood on your hands." His voice was back to its usual controlled authority, but she caught the slight roughness underneath. He turned to go, then paused, looking back over his shoulder. "The roses are beautiful, even neglected. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Then he was gone, leaving her kneeling among the thorns with her heart racing and her mind reeling from the glimpse behind his armor. For the first time in her life, someone had looked at her and seen something worth protecting. The question was, could she trust him not to change his mind?
The Alpha King was watching her again. Lyra felt his gaze like a physical touch as she moved through the great hall, serving the evening meal to pack members who barely acknowledged her existence. But she was hyper-aware of every step, every breath, every small movement under the weight of those pale green eyes that seemed to track her with predatory focus. 3 days had passed since their encounter in the garden. 3 days of stolen glances across crowded rooms, of her pulse racing whenever he entered a space she occupied, of dreams that left her waking with heat pooling low in her belly and shame burning in her chest. She was losing her mind. "More wine for the Alpha King's table," Mrs. Chen commanded, thrusting a crystal decanter into Lyra's trembling hands. "And try not to spill it on him. We can't afford another diplomatic incident." Lyra nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. The Alpha King sat at the head table beside Beta Morrison, discussing territorial boundaries with the kind of cold precision that made lesser wolves shift uncomfortably in their seats. But as she approached, those winter-pale eyes found hers, and the conversation seemed to fade into meaningless noise. She moved around the table with practiced efficiency, refilling goblets for Morrison and his Luna, for the pack's senior members who treated her like living furniture. But when she reached the Alpha King's chair, her hands betrayed her. Not with clumsiness this time, with awareness. He shifted slightly as she leaned over his shoulder to pour, and suddenly she was surrounded by his scent, pine and snow, and something darker, more masculine, that made her broken wolf whimper with longing. The heat of his body seemed to radiate through the fine fabric of his shirt, and she had to bite her lip to keep from making a sound. "Careful." His voice was low, meant only for her ears, but it sent shivers down her spine that had nothing to do with temperature. "You're shaking." She was. Her hands trembled as she poured, wine splashing dangerously close to the rim of his goblet. She could feel the warmth of his breath against her wrist, could smell the faint musk that clung to his skin, and it was doing things to her body that she didn't understand. "I'm fine," she whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. His hand came up to steady hers on the decanter, and the contact sent electricity racing up her arm. His fingers were warm, calloused from weapons training, and far too gentle for someone with his reputation. "Are you?" The question held layers of meaning that made her pulse race. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, a touch so brief it might have been accidental, but the way his pale eyes darkened suggested otherwise. Lyra pulled back sharply, nearly dropping the decanter in her haste to escape the consuming heat of his attention. She curtsied quickly and fled towards the kitchens, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She made it 3 steps before Beta Morrison's voice stopped her cold. "Your Majesty seems quite interested in our kitchen staff." The words were casual, conversational, but Lyra caught the edge underneath, the implication that hung in the air like smoke.
The Alpha King's response was quiet, but it carried clearly across the silent hall. "I find broken things fascinating, Morrison. They often hide the most interesting stories." Heat flooded Lyra's cheeks, part humiliation, part something dangerously close to arousal. He'd just called her broken in front of the entire pack, but somehow it hadn't felt like an insult. It had felt like recognition. "Of course, Your Majesty." Morrison's smile was sharp. "Though I hope our humble servant hasn't been presumptuous. She understands her place, naturally." Does she? 2 words, quietly spoken, but they carried enough threat to make Morrison's smile falter. Lyra fled. The next morning brought fresh torment in an unexpected form. Emma found her in the laundry, elbow deep in hot water and soap suds that had turned her hands red and raw. Her sister looked radiant in a dress of emerald silk that brought out the gold in her hair and made her skin glow like porcelain. "Sister," Emma's voice held the careful neutrality she'd perfected over the years. Not cruel, but not warm either. "We need to talk." Lyra didn't look up from the sheet she was scrubbing. "I'm working. This is important." Emma moved closer, her expensive perfume mixing oddly with the harsh scent of lye soap. Lyra's hands stilled on the wet fabric. "What about him?" "He asked Father about you." Emma's voice was carefully controlled, but Lyra caught the undercurrent of confusion and something that might have been jealousy. The world seemed to tilt sideways. "He what?" Father was mortified, naturally. "He explained that that you're not suitable for anything beyond service, that you're damaged goods." Emma's perfect features twisted with distaste. But the Alpha King seemed persistent in his questions. The world seemed to tilt sideways. What did he want to know? Everything. Your failed mating, your inability to shift properly, whether you'd been claimed by anyone since Marcus cast you off. Emma studied her sister's face with sharp eyes. "Lyra, what have you done?" "Nothing." The word came out as barely a whisper. "Then why is the most powerful alpha in the territories asking questions about a worthless omega who can't even hold her wolf form?" Each word hit like a physical blow, but they were nothing compared to the fear clawing at Lyra's chest. If the Alpha King was asking questions about her, if he was showing interest, what did that mean? What did he want? The obvious answer made her stomach churn with equal parts terror and shameful excitement. "Stay away from him." Emma's voice carried the authority of an omega who'd been raised to eventually command a pack. "Whatever game you think you're playing, stop it now. You'll only embarrass us all." "I'm not playing any game." "Good." Emma smoothed her silk skirts with hands that shook slightly. "Because alphas like him don't court girls like you, Lyra. They use them, and when they're done, they discard them like broken toys." Emma left her alone with the laundry and thoughts that spiraled darker with each passing minute. Because her sister was right. Powerful alphas don't court defective omegas. They might toy with them for amusement, might use them to satisfy momentary urges, but they didn't treasure them. The Alpha King had called her rare, had said rare things should be treasured. But as she stood there with her hands red from harsh soap and her heart breaking from harsh truths, Lyra wondered if she was fooling herself. Maybe she was just another broken toy, pretty enough to catch his temporary interest, but never worthy of permanent care. That night, as she served dinner once again, she kept her eyes down and her movements mechanical. She didn't look at the Alpha King, didn't let herself get lost in the fantasy that someone like him could want someone like her for anything beyond momentary entertainment. But she could still feel his gaze on her, like heat against her skin. And when she finally risked one quick glance across the room, the hunger in those pale green eyes made her wonder if she was wrong about everything. The storm that had been building all day finally broke at midnight, rattling the ancient windows of the pack house with violent wind and driving rain. Lyra couldn't sleep. She'd been tossing restlessly in her narrow bed for hours, her skin fever-hot and sensitive, her body aching with a restlessness she didn't understand. The air felt thick, oppressive, charged with electricity that made her broken wolf whimper and pace beneath her skin. Something was wrong, or maybe something was finally right, and that terrified her more than anything. She slipped from her room and padded barefoot through the darkened corridors, seeking the cool air of the gardens. But as she reached the main floor, voices drifted from the library, low, tense, unmistakably masculine. Won't be contained much longer. The Alpha King's voice carried a roughness she'd never heard before, strained and dangerous. The bond is too strong. Then claim her properly or let her go. Another voice, one of his guards. This half measure is torture for you both. You think I don't know that? Something crashed against the wall, followed by the sound of splintering wood. You think I don't feel her every waking moment, smell her scent on every breath, dream of... He cut himself off with a growl that raised every hair on Lyra's arms. Sire, with respect, she's just an omega. Take her to your bed, mark her and be done with it, or find another to slake your needs. The silence that followed was so complete, Lyra could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. When the Alpha King spoke again, his voice was deadly quiet. If you ever suggest I replace her with another, I will tear your throat out with my bare hands. The guard's hasty apology was lost as understanding crashed over Lyra like ice water. They were talking about her, about a bond she didn't understand, about claiming and marking and needs that made the most powerful alpha in the territories destroy furniture in frustrated rage. She should run, should flee back to her room and pretend she'd never heard any of it. Instead, she pushed open the library door. The Alpha King stood with his back to her, his broad shoulders rigid with tension, his dark hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. Books lay scattered across the floor, and a heavy oak chair lay in pieces against the far wall. His guard was nowhere to be seen, probably dismissed or fled. You should go. His voice was rough with barely controlled emotion. He didn't turn around. Now, while I still have enough control to let you. What bond? The words tumbled from his lips before she could stop them. What were you talking about? His shoulders went impossibly tighter. You heard. Not enough. She stepped further into the room, her bare feet silent on the scattered books. Explain it to me. Make me understand what's happening to me. What's happening to you? He turned then, and she gasped at what she saw. His pale green eyes had darkened to the colour of deep forest shadows, pupils dilated with something that looked like hunger and pain combined. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and she could see the white of his knuckles, the tremor in his fingers that spoke of barely leashed restraint. You want to know what's happening to you? He stalked toward her with predatory grace, and she should have been afraid, should have backed away from the raw power radiating from his frame. Instead, she stood her ground, chin tilted up in defiance. You're calling to me, little Omega. Every breath you take, every beat of your heart, every moment you exist in the same space as me, you're calling to something that should have died years ago. I don't understand. You're my mate. The words exploded from him like a confession torn from unwilling lips. The one the moon goddess chose for me before I was born, before I learned that caring for someone is the fastest way to watch them die. The world tilted sideways. That's impossible. Mates are... I'm broken. I can't even shift properly. I'm not... You're perfect. He was close enough now that she could see the silver flecks in his dark eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his skin. You're perfect, and everything I never dared hope for, and everything I can't afford to want. Then why? Her voice broke. Why haven't you said anything? Why let me think you were just amusing yourself with the pack failure? His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing over her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. Because the last person I loved died screaming my name while I was too proud to save her. Because everyone I've ever cared for becomes a target. Because you deserve better than a king who destroys everything he touches. Tears burned her eyes at the anguish in his voice, at the self-loathing that twisted his beautiful features. You didn't destroy me. Yet. The word was barely a whisper. Give me time. What if I don't want to give you time? The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from a place I'd thought was dead. His breath caught, and for a moment the mask slipped completely, showing her a glimpse of desperate longing that made her chest ache. You don't know what you're asking. Then show me. The storm outside chose that moment to send lightning crackling across the sky, illuminating the library in stark white light. In that flash, she saw him make his decision. His mouth crashed down on hers with devastating intensity. All the careful control he'd maintained for days shattered in an instant. This wasn't the gentle kiss of a courtly romance. This was raw, desperate, hungry. The kiss of a man who'd been denying himself something essential and finally reached his breaking point. Lyra melted into him, her hands fisting in his shirt as she kissed him back with equal desperation. His lips were warm and demanding, his taste dark and masculine and addictive. When his tongue swept along the seam of her lips, she opened for her without hesitation, moaning at the sensual invasion. He backed her against the library wall, his large body caging her in, and she'd never felt so small and protected and wanted in her entire life. His scent surrounded her, pine and winter, and something uniquely him that made her broken wolf sing with recognition. Mine, the word was growled against her lips, primitive and possessive. Mine, yes, the admission tore from her throat without conscious thought. His mouth moved to her throat, finding the spot where her pulse hammered wildly beneath thin skin. When his teeth scraped over that sensitive area, she cried out, her body arching against his with shocking need. I should mark you, he breathed against her neck, his voice rough with barely controlled hunger. Then do it. Her fingers tangled in his dark hair, holding him against her throat. Mark me, claim me, make me yours. But even as the words left her lips, she felt him tense, felt the moment reality crashed back over him like cold water. He pulled back abruptly, his breathing harsh, his eyes wild with conflict. I can't. The words seemed torn from his chest. I won't make you a target. I won't watch them use you to destroy me. That's not your choice to make. It is. His hand cupped her face again, thumb tracing her swollen lips with infinite tenderness. You don't understand what you'd be giving up. The normal life, the safe alpha who could protect you without painting a target on your back, the peaceful existence you deserve. I don't want peaceful. The words surprised her with their vehemence. I want you. For a moment, his resolve wavered. She could see it in his eyes, the desperate longing worrying with iron control. Then he stepped back, and the distance between them felt like an Arctic wind. Ask me again in daylight, he said quietly, when your blood isn't singing with mine, when you can think clearly. If you still want this, want me, then we'll talk. He turned and walked away, leaving her pressed against the library wall with her lips burning and her heart breaking. Because they both knew that daylight would bring doubt, would bring all the reasons why a defective Omega couldn't mate the Alpha King. But for one perfect, terrifying moment, she had been his, and he had been hers. Dawn brought no relief from the fire burning beneath Lyra's skin. She woke gasping, her body drenched in sweat that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with the absence of the Alpha King's touch. Every nerve ending screamed for contact she couldn't have. Every breath felt labored without his pine and winter scent to anchor her. Something was wrong with her, deeply, fundamentally wrong. The mirror above her washstand reflected a stranger, Eyes too bright, cheeks flushed with unnatural color, lips still swollen from kisses that had ended hours ago. But it was her scent that truly alarmed her. The faint, barely there fragrance that had marked her as a defected Omega her entire life had changed overnight. Now it carried undertones of something richer, more complex, something that smelled like winter storms and ancient forests, something that smelled like him. No, she whispered to her reflection, backing away from the mirror as understanding crashed over her like ice water. No, this isn't possible. But even as denial clawed at her throat, her body betrayed the truth. Her skin burned where he'd touched her. Her wolf, dormant for so long she'd forgotten its voice, paced restlessly beneath her ribs, whimpering for its mate. A sharp knock at her door made her jump. "Lyra, are you ill? You're late for kitchen duty." Mrs. Chen's voice carried the edge of someone whose patience was already stretched thin. Lyra forced herself to dress, to braid her hair with trembling fingers, to present the mask of normalcy even as her world crumbled around her. The kitchen was chaos when she arrived. Servants rushed between stations preparing the morning meal, their movements frantic with the kind of energy that came from knowing important guests were watching their every move. But the moment Lyra stepped through the doorway, the activity stilled. Every wolf in the kitchen turned toward her, nostrils flaring as they caught her altered scent. The silence stretched until it became suffocating. "What?" Mrs. Chen's words died as she approached Lyra, her weathered face going pale. "Moon goddess preserve us. Child, what have you done?" "I don't know what you mean." But she did. The scent clinging to her clothes, woven into her hair, marking her skin. It wasn't just hers anymore. It was a blend, a claiming that announced to every wolf in the vicinity that she belonged to someone. Someone powerful enough to make even the kitchen staff step back in instinctive submission. "You smell like the Alpha King." Mrs. Chen's voice was barely a whisper. "Like you've been claimed." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Around them, the other servants exchanged glances full of shock and poorly concealed envy. The pack failure had somehow caught the attention of the most powerful alpha in the territories. "It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think." Mrs. Chen grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her into the storage pantry away from curious ears. "Have you lost your mind? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Nothing happened. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "We talked, that's all." Mrs. Chen's laugh was sharp with disbelief. "Talked? Child, you're broadcasting his scent like a mated Omega. Your eyes are dilated, your skin is flushed, and you're trembling like you're in the early stages of mate fever." Mate fever. The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. She'd heard whispers about it, the consuming need that overtook newly bonded wolves, the physical and emotional dependence that made separation agonizing. But those were stories about properly matched pairs, about strong Omegas and worthy alphas, not about broken girls and kings who ruled kingdoms. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I'm defective. I can't even shift. How could I be anyone's mate, let alone his?" "The moon goddess doesn't make mistakes." Mrs. Chen's expression softened slightly. "But she also doesn't promise easy paths. If you're truly his fated mate..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "What?" Lyra demanded. "If I'm his mate, what?" "Then you're in more danger than you know. Powerful alphas have powerful enemies. And mates..." Mrs. Chen's weathered hands trembled as she gripped Lyra's shoulders. "Mates are the perfect weapons to destroy a king." The truth of it settled in Lyra's chest like lead. This was why he'd pulled away, why he'd warned her about daylight bringing clarity. Not because he didn't want her, but because wanting her could get her killed. The pantry door opened without warning, flooding the small space with morning light. Alpha Morrison stood silhouetted in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. His voice carried the kind of quiet rage that made lesser wolves bare their throats in submission. Lyra flinched at the crude language, but Mrs. Chen stepped protectively in front of her. "Morrison, mind your tongue. Whatever happened between them?" "What happened is that this worthless Omega has endangered my entire pack." Morrison's eyes blazed with the kind of fury that came from having one's authority threatened. "Do you think the Alpha King's enemies won't notice his new interest? Do you think they won't use her to get to him?" Each word hit like a lash, but Lyra forced herself to stand straighter. "I didn't ask for this." "No, you didn't throw yourself at him every chance you got. Didn't use your Omega wilds to trap a king who could give you everything you've never had." "I never." "You never what? Never fantasized about being more than the pack's biggest disappointment? Never dreamed of trading your virginity for a crown?" The slap echoed through the space before Lyra realized she'd moved. Her palm stung from the contact with Morrison's cheek, and the shock on his face was almost worth what would surely come next. Almost. "How dare you?" Morrison's hand rose, but before he could strike, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. The temperature in the pantry seemed to drop 10 degrees. Power flooded the small space, so overwhelming that Morrison actually staggered backward, his aggressive posture crumbling into instinctive submission. Alpha King Thane filled the doorway like an avenging god, his pale green eyes blazing with barely controlled fury. He looked every inch the predator, muscles coiled for violence, authority radiating from every line of his frame. But it was the way his gaze immediately sought Lyra, the visible relief that crossed his features when he saw she was unharmed, that made her heart clench with desperate longing. "Your Majesty," Morrison stammered, his voice cracking, "I was just—" "You were just threatening my mate." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. My mate. He'd said it out loud, claimed her, publicly, in a way that couldn't be taken back or dismissed as rumor. Morrison's face went white. "Your Majesty, surely you don't mean, she's nothing, a defective Omega who can't even—" "She's mine." The words carried the weight of absolute law. The Alpha King stepped into the pantry, and Morrison scrambled backward to make room. This close, Lyra could see the strain in his features, the dark circles under his eyes that suggested he'd slept as poorly as she had. When his gaze met hers, she saw her own desperate need reflected in those winter-pale depths. The bond pulled between them like a physical thing, demanding contact, completion, the joining that would ease the fire burning beneath both their skins. But she also saw his resolve, iron-hard and unshakable. "Pack your belongings," he said quietly, never taking his eyes off her face. "Your Majesty," Morrison began. "Leave, now, before I forget that you're technically an ally." Morrison fled, Mrs. Chen close behind, leaving them alone in the cramped pantry surrounded by sacks of flour and hanging herbs. "I can't," whispered Lyra. "You know I can't." "You can and you will." His voice was rough with emotion barely held in. "The bond is killing us both. Look at yourself. You're burning with fever, your wolf is going mad from separation, and it's only going to get worse." She could feel it, the truth of his words. Her skin felt too tight, her bones ached, and there was a restless energy building in her chest that demanded release. But his hand came up to cup her face, and the moment their skin connected, relief flooded through her, so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. "Please," he whispered, and the vulnerability in that single word undid her completely. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes as the mate bond sang with recognition and rightness. Outside the pantry, she could hear the pack beginning their daily routines, unaware that their world was about to change forever. "Yes," she whispered, and felt the future reshape itself around that single word.
The message came at dawn, delivered by a guard whose hands shook as he passed the blood-stained parchment to the Alpha King. Lyra watched from across the courtyard as Thane's face went granite still, his pale green eyes scanning the words once, twice, then a third time as if he could change their meaning through sheer force of will. She'd been packing her meager belongings, her heart lighter than it had been in years, despite the lingering ache of the incomplete mate bond. For the first time in her life, she had somewhere to go, someone who wanted her. Then she saw his expression, and ice flooded her veins. "What is it?" she asked, approaching him with careful steps. The other guards had melted away, leaving them alone in the pre-dawn darkness. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crumpled the parchment in his fist, his knuckles white with strain. "They have my nephew." His voice was completely devoid of emotion, which somehow made it more terrifying than any roar of rage. "Marcus, he's 8 years old." Understanding crashed over her like a physical blow. "Your enemies." "The Eastern Coalition. They've been waiting for this, for me to show weakness, to give them leverage." His pale eyes met hers, and she saw her own death reflected in their depths. "They know about you." The words hung in the air between them like a sword ready to fall. Lyra's hands trembled as she reached for him, but he stepped back, putting distance between them that felt like an ocean. "How do they know?" "Morrison." The name came out like a curse. "He sent word the moment I claimed you publicly. Thought he was protecting his pack from the fallout of our bond. Instead, he'd painted a target on her back in blood." "The message is clear," Thane continued, his voice growing colder with each word. "They'll trade Marcus for you, one innocent life for another." "Then we go to them together?" "No." The word exploded from him with enough force to make her flinch. "You don't understand what these wolves are capable of. They're not just my political enemies, they're savages who've been waiting decades for the chance to destroy me." "I'm not afraid." "You should be." He stalked toward her, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw the predator everyone else feared. "Do you know what they did to the last Omega they captured? They kept her alive for 3 months, sending pieces of her to her mate, one finger at a time, until he finally broke and gave them what they wanted." Horror clawed at her throat, but she forced herself to stand straight. "That won't happen to me. You won't let it." "I won't get the chance." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Because you're not going with me. You're staying here, under Morrison's protection, until this is over." The betrayal hit her like a physical slap. "You said you wanted me with you. You said—" "I said a lot of things before I remembered why I swore never to take a mate." His voice was brutal now, designed to cut deep and leave scars. "This is what happens when I care about someone. They become weapons to be used against me. So that's it." Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "You're going to abandon me the first time things get difficult?" "I'm going to save a child's life by removing the only bargaining chip they have." He turned away from her, unable to meet her eyes. "Pack your things and go back to the kitchens. Pretend the last few days never happened." "I can't do that." Her voice broke on the words. "The mate bond. It's killing me to be away from you for even minutes. How am I supposed to—" "You'll learn to live with the pain. I did." The casual cruelty of the statement nearly brought her to her knees. This was the Alpha King everyone feared. Cold, calculating, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone to achieve his goals. Including her. "You're just like them," she whispered, the words torn from her chest like pieces of her soul. "Morrison, Marcus, all the others who looked at me and saw something disposable. I thought you were different." For just a moment, his mask slipped, and she saw the agony he was trying to hide. But then it slammed back into place, and he was once again the untouchable king who ruled through fear. You were wrong. He walked away without looking back, leaving her standing alone in the courtyard as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky blood red. The next 3 days passed in a haze of agony that had nothing to do with physical pain. The mate bond, partially formed and then brutally severed, felt like having her soul torn in half. Every breath was an effort. Food tasted like ash. Sleep brought nightmares of Thane's rejection, of his cold dismissal, of the way he'd looked at her like she meant nothing. The pack treated her return to the kitchens with a mixture of pity and vindicated satisfaction. She was back where she belonged, scrubbing floors and tending fires, invisible and unwanted. But the whispers followed her everywhere. She thought she could catch a king, spread her legs for power, and got exactly what she deserved. The Alpha King probably laughed about her naivety. Each comment was another cut, another reminder that she'd been foolish enough to believe someone could want her for more than momentary entertainment. On the third night, as she lay in her narrow bed staring at the ceiling, she heard them coming. Footsteps, too light to be pack guards, too coordinated to servants moving through the halls. The scent that drifted under her door was wrong. Wild, violent, carrying the stench of rogue wolves who'd abandoned all pack law. The Eastern Coalition had come for her after all. Her door splintered inward with a crash that echoed through the sleeping pack house. 3 figures filled the doorway, massive, scarred, their eyes glowing with predatory hunger in the darkness. "There she is," the largest one growled, his voice rough with cruelty. "The Alpha King's precious little mate." Lyra scrambled backward, but there was nowhere to go. Her small room was a trap, and she was too weak from the severed bond to shift, to fight, to do anything but cower like the worthless Omega everyone said she was. "Please," she whispered, hating herself for the plea, but unable to stop it. "I'm nothing to him now. He cast me aside. I'm not worth—" "Oh, little Omega," the rogue's smile was full of jagged teeth. "You're worth everything to us." Strong hands grabbed her before she could scream, dragging her from the bed and toward the window. Below, she could see more figures moving through the shadows, an entire pack of rogues who'd infiltrated Morrison's territory while the guards slept. As they hauled her through the window and into the night, one thought burned through her despair with crystalline clarity. Thane had been wrong. Pushing her away hadn't kept her safe. It had delivered her directly into their enemies' hands. And now they will both pay the price for his choice.
The silver chains burned against Lyra's wrists like liquid fire, but the pain was nothing compared to the agony of the severed mate bond clawing at her chest. She'd been chained in the center of the abandoned warehouse for 2 days, displayed like bait while the Eastern Coalition waited for their trap to spring. The rogue wolves circled her constantly, their feral scents mixing into a nauseating cocktail of violence and madness that made her broken wolf whimper in terror. But as dawn light filtered through the broken windows, something else stirred beneath her fear. Rage. "Still think your king will come for you?" Victor, the coalition's leader, crouched in front of her with predatory amusement. Half his face was a ruin of scars, testament to some long-ago battle that had left him more monster than man. "It's been 2 days, little Omega. 2 days since we sent word of your situation. Perhaps he's decided you're not worth the risk after all." Each word was designed to cut, to break her spirit the way the silver chains broke her skin. But instead of crumbling, Lyra felt something hardening inside her chest, like steel forged in fire. "He'll come." Her voice was steady, despite the pain, despite the fear, despite the part of her that wondered if Victor might be right. Victor's laugh was sharp with mockery. Will he? From what I hear, he cast you aside easily enough when things became complicated. Sent you back to scrubbing floors like the worthless servant you've always been. I'm not worthless. The words surprised her with their quiet conviction. Around the warehouse, several rogues paused their pacing to look at her with curiosity. Even Victor's scarred features showed a flicker of interest. No. Then tell me, little Omega, what exactly are you worth? You can't shift properly, can't fight, can't even hold your mate's interest long enough to be claimed properly. His claws traced the air near her throat without quite touching. What possible value could a broken thing like you have? 2 days ago the questions would have destroyed her, would have confirmed every cruel whisper, every dismissive glance, every moment of being overlooked and discarded. But sitting here in chains, facing death at the hands of savages, Lyra finally understood something that had taken her 22 years to learn. Her worth wasn't determined by other people's ability to see it. I'm worth everything, she said quietly, because he's my mate, because I survived being cast aside and found the strength to keep going, because I'm sitting here right now, refusing to break, no matter what you do to me. Victor's amusement flickered, replaced with something darker. Brave words from someone about to die. Then kill me. She met his gaze directly, chin raised in defiance that made his eyes narrow. Stop talking and do it, because the longer you keep me alive, the closer he gets to finding me. As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the warehouse plummeted. Power flooded the space like a physical presence, so overwhelming that even the rogues whimpered and pressed themselves against the walls. The broken windows rattled in their frames, and every loose piece of debris began to vibrate with suppressed energy. Alpha King Thane had arrived. Victor spun toward the entrance as the massive doors exploded inward, torn from their hinges by invisible force. Through the swirling dust and debris, a figure stepped into the warehouse like death given form. But this wasn't the controlled, civilized king Lyra remembered from the pack house. This was something primal and terrifying, an alpha stripped of all pretense, driven by mate-bond fury to the edge of madness. His pale green eyes blazed with inhuman light, his massive frame vibrating with barely contained violence. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who has never been denied anything. Release her now. I don't think so. Victor had recovered his composure, though Lyra could smell the fear sweat beneath his bravado. You see, we have terms to discuss first. Your mate's life in exchange for... The rogue never finished the sentence. Thane moved with liquid grace, crossing the warehouse floor in a blur of motion that ended with his hand wrapped around Victor's throat. The smaller wolf was lifted off his feet, claws scrabbling uselessly at the iron grip that held him. I don't negotiate with dead wolves. But Victor had planned for this. Even as his leader gasped for air, the other rogues moved into position, a dozen of them, all armed with silver-tipped weapons that could kill even an Alpha King. Careful, Victor wheezed, gesturing towards his pack with his free hand. One wrong move and they'll fill you so full of silver you'll be dead before you hit the ground. Thane's grip tightened, and Victor's face began to turn purple. I'm willing to take that risk. But are you willing to risk her? The words made Thane freeze. Following Victor's gaze, he saw what Lyra had missed in the chaos. A rogue positioned directly behind her chair, silver blade pressed against the pulse point in her neck. Let me go and we'll discuss terms, Victor continued, his voice strained but triumphant. Kill me and she dies with me. For a moment the warehouse was perfectly silent except for the sound of Victor's laboured breathing. Lyra could see the war playing out across Thane's features, rage warring with desperation, the need to protect her fighting against his dominant nature that demanded he crush his enemies. It's okay. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. Thane, It's okay." His pale eyes snapped to hers, and she saw her own death reflected in their depths. He was going to let Victor go, was going to negotiate, to bargain, to try to save her life at the cost of his own dignity and probably his kingdom, just like he tried to save his sister all those years ago.
No, the word came from somewhere deep inside her, from a place she'd never known existed. Don't you dare sacrifice yourself for me. Lyra, I said no. She twisted in her chains, ignoring the way the silver burned deeper into her flesh. I'm not your sister, Thane. I'm not a victim who needs to be saved. I'm your mate. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition that went deeper than words. The incomplete mate bond that had been causing them both agony suddenly flared to life, connecting them with threads of power and understanding. Through that connection, she felt his love, his desperate need to protect her, his willingness to die if it meant keeping her safe. But she also felt something else, his faith in her strength, buried beneath layers of fear and guilt, but burning bright as a star. I know what I'm worth now, she said quietly, her gaze never leaving his. Do you? Understanding flashed in his pale eyes. Without hesitation, he released Victor and stepped back, hands raised in apparent surrender. Terms, he said simply. Victor rubbed his throat, grinning with vicious satisfaction. Smart king. Here's what's going to happen. He never saw Lyra's hands slip free from the chains. The silver had burned through her wrists to the bone, but pain was nothing compared to the clarity flowing through the mate bond. She could feel Thane's presence like a second heartbeat, could sense the exact moment he would move. As Victor turned back toward her, still gloating, she drove the broken chain link deep into his eye. His scream shattered the warehouse silence, and in that moment of chaos, Thane struck. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. The Alpha King moved through the rogues like a force of nature, all pretense of civilized restraint abandoned. Bodies fell around him in sprays of blood and bone, their silver weapons useless against an opponent who moved too fast to target. But even as he fought, she could feel his pain through their bond. Silver blades found their mark, leaving wounds that wouldn't heal quickly. He was bleeding from a dozen cuts, his movements slowing with each passing second. Victor, half-blind and maddened with pain, lunged toward her with claws extended. If I can't have my revenge, I'll settle for your death. The words cut off as Lyra's wolf finally, impossibly, emerged. It wasn't the powerful shift she'd dreamed of her entire life. Her wolf was small, pale, seemingly fragile, everything the pack had always said she was. But in that moment, as silver claws reached for her throat, size didn't matter. Speed did. She twisted away from Victor's attack and struck back with precision that surprised them both. Her small fangs found the artery in his neck, and his life poured out in crimson streams across the warehouse floor. As his body hit the ground, the remaining rogues broke and ran. Thane stood among the bodies, swaying on his feet, pale eyes wide with something between shock and pride. You shifted. Finally. Lyra shifted back into human form, her body shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. The silver burns on her wrists were already beginning to heal now that her wolf had emerged. You moved toward her on unsteady legs, his face grey from blood loss. Are you hurt? I'm perfect. She caught him as he collapsed, his weight nearly taking them both to the ground. But you're not. I'll heal. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing over her cheekbone with infinite tenderness. You found your wolf. I found myself. She pressed her forehead against his, breathing in his pine and winter scent like a prayer answered. No one will ever call me worthless again. Through their bond, she felt his fierce agreement, his overwhelming love, his pride in her strength. My queen, he whispered against her lips. And for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she was worth. Everything. The Northern Territories had never seen a claiming ceremony like this one. Lyra stood at the center of the ancient stone circle, surrounded by representatives from every major pack in the kingdom. The winter wind whipped through her hair, no longer the mousy brown of a servant, but burnished gold that caught the moonlight like spun metal. The transformation that had begun with her first shift had continued in the weeks since the warehouse, reshaping not just her wolf, but her human form as well. She was still small, still delicate by traditional standards, but now that delicacy carried the dangerous grace of a blade, beautiful, sharp, and utterly lethal to those who underestimated it. "This is madness," the whisper carried from the assembled crowd, one voice among many that had questioned the Alpha King's decision to publicly claim a mate who had been rejected by her own pack less than 2 months ago. "She's nobody, a kitchen servant. How can she stand beside a king?" Lyra didn't flinch at the words. Once they would have destroyed her, confirmed every doubt that had ever lived in her chest. Now they simply rolled off her like water off stone, because she knew what she was worth. The crowd fell silent as Thane stepped into the circle. He moved with the fluid grace of an apex predator, every line of his body radiating the kind of power that made lesser wolves bare their throats in instinctive submission. But when his pale green eyes found hers across the sacred space, all that lethal authority gentled into something infinitely precious. Love. Pure, devastating, unshakable love. "You could still change your mind," he said quietly, his voice carrying only to her ears despite the hundreds watching. "Walk away now. Live a normal life with a mate who won't paint a target on your back simply by breathing." Her answer was to step toward him, closing the distance between them with movements that carried their own predatory grace. "Try to get rid of me now and see what happens." His mouth curved in the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since the warehouse. "Threatening your king, little queen?" "Promising him." She reached up to cup his face, thumb brushing over the scar along his temple. "I'm done running from who I am, from who we are." The ancient words of the claiming ritual had been spoken in this circle for 1,000 years, passed down through generations of kings and queens who had stood where they stood now. But when Thane spoke them, they felt brand new. "Before the moon goddess and the assembled packs, I claim you as my mate, my equal, my queen." His voice carried across the circle, formal and ritual, but his eyes never left hers. "Do you accept this claim?" Traditional ceremony would have her kneel, bow her head in submission, speak words of obedience and service. Lyra had read about claiming rituals in the book she devoured as a servant, had memorized the responses expected of royal mates. She ignored every one of them. "Before the moon goddess and the assembled packs, I claim you as my mate, my equal, my king." A murmur rippled through the crowd, shocked whispers at her deviation from tradition. "Do you accept this claim?" For a heartbeat, the silence was complete. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Thane threw back his head and laughed, a sound of pure joy that transformed his harsh features into something breathtaking. "I accept, my queen, now and always." The claiming bite was supposed to be civilized, gentle, a ritual marking that sealed the bond without drama or spectacle. What happened between them was none of those things. The moment their lips touched, the incomplete mate bond that had been tormenting them both exploded into completion. Power flooded the circle, so overwhelming that several of the watching wolves stumbled backward.
The very air crackled with energy as two souls that had been searching for each other across lifetimes finally, completely merged. Fane's mouth was demanding against hers, all pretense of control abandoned as the primal claiming instincts took over. His hands tangled in her hair, tilting her head to expose the vulnerable curve of her throat. When his teeth scraped over her pulse point, she moaned and arched against him, her body recognizing its mate on a level deeper than conscious thought. "Mine," he growled against her neck, his voice rough with need and possession. "Yours," she agreed breathlessly. "But you're mine too. Don't forget that." His bite was swift, precise, and utterly devastating. The claiming mark blazed to life on her throat, not the small, discreet mark of traditional matings, but something bold and unmistakable, a stylized crown that announced to every wolf who saw her exactly who she belonged to. And when she bid him in return, marking him with her own claim, the answering mark that appeared on his neck was equally bold, a rose surrounded by thorns, beautiful but dangerous, just like the woman who had given it to him. The power that erupted from their completed bond knocked half the watching wolves to their knees. Ancient magic that had been dormant for generations stirred to life, recognizing the union of true mates, of a king and queen whose bond would reshape the very foundations of the pack world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the circle had gone completely silent. "Any objections?" Fane asked mildly, his arms still wrapped possessively around her waist. No one spoke. No one dared. Good. His smile was sharp with satisfied possession. "Then kneel for your queen." The sound of hundreds of wolves dropping to their knees in the frozen ground was like thunder, but she barely heard it, too lost in the overwhelming rightness of the bond humming between them, the knowledge that she had finally found her place in the world, not as someone's cast-off or consolation prize, but as a queen who had chosen her own crown. 1 year later, Lyra returned to the Crescent Moon Pack for the first time since her claiming. She came not as a servant or a supplicant, but as the queen of the Northern Territories, arriving in a convoy that made the Alpha King's previous visit look modest by comparison. Black vehicles stretched down the mountain road like a river of shadows, each one bearing the royal crest that now belonged to her as much as it did to Thane. The pack house had been scrubbed until it gleamed, every surface polished to mirror brightness in preparation for her visit. Bate Morrison waited on the front steps with his Luna and the pack senior members, their faces carefully neutral masks that couldn't quite hide their nervousness. "Your Majesty," Morrison's bow was precisely calculated, deep enough to show respect, not so deep as to show submission to someone who had once scrubbed his flaws. "Your Majesty, welcome back to Crescent Moon territory." Lyra stepped out of the lead vehicle with fluid grace, her movements carrying the predatory elegance that had developed along with her power. The simple servant's dress had been replaced by clothing fit for a queen, deep blue silk that brought out the gold in her transformed hair, jewelry that caught the afternoon light like captured stars. But it was her bearing that truly marked the change. She stood with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her own worth, who had claimed her place in the world through strength rather than birth or luck. Morrison, her voice was warm but distant, carrying the polite disinterest of royalty, acknowledging a minor territorial leader. "Thank you for hosting us." The words were perfectly correct, but they carried an undercurrent that made Morrison's jaw tighten. She had thanked him for hosting us, herself and her king, not for welcoming her home, because this wasn't her home anymore.
It never truly had been. Emma appeared at her mother's side, resplendent in emerald silk that complemented her golden beauty, but for the first time in their lives she looked diminished standing next to her older sister. Pretty, certainly, well-bred and accomplished, but completely overshadowed by the quiet power radiating from the woman she had once pitied. Sister. The word carried decades of complicated history. Sister. Lyra's smile was genuine but brief. You look well.
As do you. Emma's gaze flickered over Lyra's transformation, the confident posture, the expensive clothes, the claiming marks that were still visible despite the high neckline of her dress. Marriage suits you. Choosing my own path suits me. The correction was gentle but unmistakable. Emma flushed, understanding the implication. She had been raised to be chosen, groomed to catch the right alpha's attention and secure her family's status through marriage. Lyra had taken a different route, forging her own strength, claiming her own power, becoming worthy of a crown through her actions rather than her bloodline. The pack has prospered under your influence, Lunacera said carefully. The trade agreements you negotiated have brought considerable wealth to our territory. Queen Lyra has negotiated treaties with every major pack in the Eastern Territories. Thane's voice carried from behind them, rich with pride. She has a gift for seeing solutions others miss. He emerged from the second vehicle, like darkness given form, all predatory grace and barely leashed power. But when his pale green eyes found Lyra, his expression softened into something that made several of the watching pack members sigh with envy. A year of marriage had only deepened the bond between them. They moved together like two parts of a whole, each instinctively aware of the other's presence. When Thane's hand settled on the small of Lyra's back, she leaned into the touch with unconscious trust. Your Majesty, Morrison addressed Thane with considerably more deference than he'd shown Lyra. We're honored by your visit. My queen wished to see her childhood home. I go where she goes. The casual declaration sent ripples through the assembled pack. The Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the territories, had just announced that he followed his mate's desires, rather than expecting her to follow his. Mrs. Chen appeared at the edge of the crowd, her weathered face creased with an expression Lyra couldn't quite read. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment Lyra was 18 again, kneeling on cold stone floors while the head cook berated her for clumsiness. Then Mrs. Chen dropped into a deep curtsy, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet courtyard. Your Majesty, it's an honor to serve you again. The honor is mine, Mrs. Chen. Lyra moved toward the older woman with genuine warmth. Your kindness meant more to me than you know. Tears gathered in Mrs. Chen's eyes as understanding passed between them. The head cook remembered the small kindnesses, the bread left where a hungry servant would find it, the gentle correction instead of harsh punishment, the moments of humanity in a place that had often felt devoid of it. You were always special, Mrs. Chen whispered, even when the rest of us were too blind to see it. The afternoon progressed through formal ceremonies and diplomatic pleasantries. Pack members who had once looked through Lyra as if she didn't exist now competed for her attention, eager to claim some connection to the woman who had risen from servant to queen. Brett Hartwell was notably absent from the proceedings. As evening approached, Lyra found herself alone in the gardens where Thane had first shown her his vulnerability. The roses were blooming again, tended by a new gardener who understood their worth. The neglect that had once mirrored her own situation had been replaced by careful cultivation. Any regrets? Thane's voice was soft as he joined her beside the largest bush, the one she had been deadheading that morning when he'd found her bleeding from thorns. About leaving? She considered the question seriously, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. No, this was never home. It was just where I started, and where we are now.
She turned to face him, this man who had seen worth in her when no one else could, who had given her the space to discover her own strength, who had claimed her not as a possession but as an equal. "Home," she said simply. But even as she spoke the word, she knew it wasn't entirely accurate. Home wasn't a place for her anymore. It wasn't even a person, though Thane was certainly her anchor. Home was the knowledge that she had chosen her own path, that she had refused to accept other people's definition of her worth and instead had created her own, that she was not healed by love. Love had simply given her the safety to heal herself. She was still complex, still scarred by the years of rejection and dismissal. The servants who bowed to her now couldn't undo the damage of their past cruelty, and she wouldn't pretend they could. But those scars no longer defined her. They were simply part of her story, evidence of how far she had traveled from the broken girl who had once scrubbed floors and accepted cruelty as her due. "Your Majesty," a guard approached with careful deference, "the vehicles are ready for departure." Lyra nodded, taking one last look at the gardens where she had once sought refuge. Then she turned toward the future she had chosen, her hand warm in her mate's, her crown invisible but unshakable. Behind them, the pack watched their queen leave, with a mixture of regret and awe. They had held a treasure in their midst and thrown it away, never recognizing its value until it was too late to reclaim. But Lyra didn't look back. She had learned long ago that the past was simply a place she had visited, not a place she needed to stay. And their future, was waiting.